Hi, I'm Lisa Fletcher, and you're in the stream. Today, as Syria's humanitarian crisis deepens, are politics preventing aid money from getting to those who need it most? Our digital producer, Malika Bilal, is here looking out for your live feedback. Malika, I've been watching TweetDeck and Twitter for the last couple of hours, and while we're getting interaction, it's not as much as we usually get. And I'm wondering if people are just having fatigue with Syria.
I think there's also a lot of cynicism with the people that are talking about Syria. We're following right now the hashtag UN pays Assad and its criticism over UN aid funds going to the government. Aisha says if the UN is unable to stop Assad, they should at least not fund him. They know what he's going to use the money for. Well, that sparked a conversation, and Hamid on Twitter says, I'm confused with this issue. I've read that it was a false rumor and that the UN has been delivering aid to rebel-held areas. Of course, this is something we're going to delve into on the show today. So for those of you at home, if you'd like to join the conversation, tweet us with the hashtag AJStream.
And with us on set is Middle East scholar and activist Majid Rafizadeh. He is president and director of the International American Council on the Middle East, and much of his family still resides in Damascus. Majid, welcome to the stream.
Thank you for having me.
Remember, as always, you can keep in touch with us on Twitter. Tell us what you think. Even tweet us some ideas for future shows. Just use the hashtag AJStream. It's just one more way that you can be in the stream. Now, here are some of the hashtags that you've been following. "60,000 Syrians killed and more than 4 million in need of humanitarian assistance," according to the latest United Nations reports. UN peace envoy Lakhdar Brahimi told the Security Council that Syria's conflict has now reached unprecedented levels of horror. Heavy fighting between President Assad's forces and rebels has destroyed the country's infrastructure, turning schools, hospitals, and local businesses to rubble. Since the uprising began 2 years ago, more than 700,000 have fled Syria, taking refuge in neighboring countries. Now, with war-battled Syrians in desperate need of aid, donor countries continue to pledge large sums of money. At a recent conference in Kuwait, more than $1.5 billion was promised, with the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait each guaranteeing $300 million. But with much of the money channeled through Syria's government, where does it really go? And are some of the international donors partly to blame for the conflict itself? Joining us from Geneva is Lara Satrakian, co-founder and managing editor of Syria Deeply. It's an independent digital media project that merges citizen journalism with the standards of the professional press. And with us from Turkey is Razan Shalab Al-Sham, an activist and aid worker from Homs. She travels between Turkey and Syria delivering aid. Welcome to the stream, everyone.
Good to be here.
Majid, I want to start with you because you have family still living in Damascus and other parts of Syria. What are you hearing from your family? You talk to them almost every day.
Right. What I'm mainly hearing is the question that many Syrian and some of my friends, activists who are working there, they're asking that we hear all about the Western media and the Western rhetoric about democracy and about helping, promoting human rights. So what about the Syrian, that more than 60,000 people have been killed here? So why it took 1 or 2 months to intervene in Libya, and why they're not helping us in this crisis? And is it just the oil, or is it there is other strategic interests? So this is the main questions that I've been hearing from the people, besides all the crisis and tragic situation that the families, almost every family I know, they have lost someone.
Including your own family.
Right.
Tell us what happened.
I had 3 of my cousins, including one of 4 years old girl. They were shot in Damascus, and each group blames the other. The state media, they came to the scene and they said these are the terrorists, they done that, and they showed it on TV, and then the rebels blaming the
These are some of the pictures actually of your family that we're showing right now.
Right, and these are my niece and nephew. They were injured in an explosions. They were taken to the hospital. And I mean, my family situation is not unique. There are a lot of families which are really going through more severe situations, and there are many children in Syria that they're not speaking anymore. They're just traumatized with the situation, and yeah, this is just one aspect of what is happening inside Syria.
Razan, you've been in and out of Syria a lot, gathering firsthand knowledge of what's really happening to folks on the ground. Give us a taste of what you've seen.
Okay, good evening. The situation inside Syria is very bad now. We always enter liberated areas and see the bad situation inside between people in Syria. Especially in liberated area, the regime cut all the needs and all the supporting, it's supporting to them. People are homeless now inside the tents and the camps in liberated areas and also under the trees. There are a lot of needs. There are a very urgent situation. A lot of the sisters come through these people in the tents and in the camps also.
Well, Laura, I'd like to direct a video comment left by one of our community members, and it's telling of the human stories in Syria. Have a listen to this.
Syrians in the liberated areas we visited are barely able to survive the daily barrage of shelling by the Assad regime. We met with the local civilian administrative councils in Aleppo, and unfortunately we did not see any evidence of any coordinated or consistent aid from any governments, while people die of cold, hunger, and medical issues. $1.5 billion is a lot of aid that could truly save hundreds of thousands of Syrians this year, but Syrians are skeptical it will actually reach them.
Now, of course, Laura, you're the founder of Syria Deeply, and this is an issue that you're covering extensively. What do you make of the comments just made in that video comment?
My heart breaks because I know it's true. I know people are waiting online for 6 hours for bread in Aleppo, that they don't have food, they don't have fuel, that kids are dying of cold in refugee camps, that families are trying to keep their tents warm with fires that then too often, end up catching fire and creating a whole different sort of tragedy for these families. We're hearing it left and right. We're hearing it from teachers in homes telling us that schools are packed in with refugees seeking shelter from other parts of the city. And that obviously keeps kids out of class. That disrupts a whole generation's education. I'm so sorry to hear about Majid's family. We're hearing it. We're also hearing this notion that there's really more than one way to lose a life in this scenario. Some people are losing their lives. Some people are losing their life savings. The cost of food is up so high that people are spending everything they have just trying to put food on the table. And I had a reporter friend who was in Aleppo covering one of those bread lines, and people turning to her and saying, does the outside world know this is happening? Because we can't possibly believe that people are hearing about this and it's still going on. And to this question, this concern over whether that aid really reaches people on the ground, I mean, it's just a fact of how we do aid right now, that so much official aid goes through government-sanctioned groups, government-sanctioned NGOs. You know, it reaches people in need, but through those official channels.
Yeah, and you know, Laura, I want to get to
So,
that. I want to get to that in a minute, and have you talk more about those sanctioned versus non-sanctioned areas and whether the aid does or does not get to them. But as you so articulately mentioned a minute ago, politics so often does overtake these human issues during war. A Syrian-American surgeon who works with the Union of Syrian Medical Relief Organizations actually spoke with the Stream, and he told us about his recent trip to Syria and the harsh realities that are faced on the ground.
The crisis is a humanitarian one. I mean, the politics being pushed aside, if we're talking about the issues on the ground, people, literally the issue of starvation that's occurring. I've seen children that are 10, 12, 14, 15 years old, and they look much younger than their age, and that's because of the nutritional issues. I see women suffering from conditions that we take for granted. I've seen scabies and vitamin C deficiency conditions. I mean, this is a humanitarian issue, and so as the world kind of discusses the politics of Syria, the Syrian people on the ground are really not caring about the issues of the politics. What they care about is, how do I feed my family the next day?
Razan, what do you see as the game changer here? What makes this become a humanitarian crisis in the eyes of the world versus a political issue?
Okay, according to what I see every day, people really don't care about politics. People need to feed their children. People need to feed their women who became homeless now, and their children who became who can't continue their study in their schools because their schools changed to be location for refugees. People are in need for help more than politics nowadays. People are hungry.
But Majid, what has to happen? What's the game-changing moment that shifts this for people?
Well, I think what makes the Syrian case very complicated is that we have three concentric circles of tension going simultaneously, and I think the first circle is the domestic one, which we have different groups of rebels and revolutionaries fighting against Assad, and neither of these groups can it seems to be able to win over the other. And then we have the domestic, the Cold War between the Iranian government and the Arab Gulf state, particularly Saudi Arabia, and their strategic interest in the region. And then Iran supporting the Assad regime, and Saudi Arabia wants to support the rebels. And then we have the international arena, China and Russia on one side supporting Assad regime, and then we have United States and other Western countries on the other side, and the UN Security Council political paralysis on really solving this problem. So we really need something comprehensive to address all these three levels in order to save the lives in Syria.
Meanwhile, Lara Satrakian, billions of dollars pledged, 1.5 billion pledged just last week. You started to talk about this a few minutes ago. Let's get into it more now. Where is this money actually going?
Well, we had one op-ed on Syria Deeply by Barak Barfi of the New America Foundation. He crunched the numbers in a kind of interesting way. He looked at how it's being apportioned, that a third of it's going to folks inside Syria, the rest is going to folks outside of Syria. And he said that means that while each Syrian refugee outside Syria will receive $1,654 in aid, civilians in the country will only get $208 a head, so to speak, for this aid. So even if that's distributed evenly, you're going to get this situation where people inside the country are just not getting what they need. It's just not going to reach them. And on the fact that some of this would go through government channels or government-sanctioned NGOs that have more freedom to operate in government-controlled areas, it just means that getting aid to those rebel-held areas is going to be all the more difficult. I don't know, frankly, Lisa, when we travel to refugee camps, when we hear these stories, it's hard to tell sometimes who's worse off. Folks in refugee camps are miserable. We were in Zatari a while back, and people felt like they were in prison. They were so frustrated at their conditions there. Even though everyone in the picture, the UN, the Jordanians, are doing the best they can, we saw people getting on buses back to Daraa, back to Syria, because they were so unhappy with life in the camp. So it's just a mess. It's straining the social fabric in Syria in ways that we worried would happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is one solution on Twitter. A comrade says, this is very simple. The UN has just given Assad more money to acquire more weapons from Russia. That's his opinion. But he says aid must not come in the form of cash. Majid, there's also a tweet here from Ali who says, how effective is aid without some level of political change and access to those in need? Because absent that, the money is being pumped into the same problems.
Right. I think this is very important. I think what we're talking about is that usually the Western media, they don't really show this fact that this money is only just for 6 months and it's not going to be available soon. So in June, again, we will be sitting here and talking about the crisis, the probably more severe crisis in Syria, and how we can help more refugees or displaced people in Syria. But the other thing about foreign aid is also that foreign aid is really does not come out of altruistic motivation. Foreign aid is always tied to either influence the political process inside the country, or either in the international politics to support an ally. So you see Russia and China, or the top donors on top, they're trying to help the Assad regime, and they want the money go through the Assad regime. And you see on the other side, Saudi Arabia, United States, they want the rebels get the fund in order to change the regime.
Laura, you know, one of the things we've talked a lot about is this idea that the hospitals have been such a big target, which of course is then forcing doctors to move to other locations, these secret clinics where they can treat people, but the secret clinics are not considered official structures. So there are NGOs that are refusing to help So that means the doctors are going without supplies and without medications. Talk a little bit about what these official structures really mean in the scheme of distributing aid.
On your first point, we've heard the same thing from Doctors Without Borders. They're talking about how hard it is now to deliver medical aid, that critical basics. If you have cancer right now, if you have any terminal illness in Syria, it's really hard to get treatment. And in that push that you described, the fallout of that is everything from an uptick in miscarriages and complications with pregnancy, because women can't get to places where they can be properly cared for when they go into labor. But, you know, putting that aside, to answer your question, it's the way the business of aid is done. I mean, these are questions. Countries have sovereignty. The UN respects that. These are government-commissioned NGOs, licensed NGOs that deliver aid. It's not to say that every dollar that goes through the regime is going to pay for Russian weapons, but it may well go to NGOs that just strengthen this perception that the government is taking care of things on its side. On the regime side of town, you might get good treatment, you might get aid, you might get handouts, but then on the rebel-held side, life is just turning into complete chaos. It reinforces what seems to be the Assad strategy of complete just scorched earth on the rebel side, collective punishment, make life miserable. And if that aid is just going more to the regime-held side than to the rebel-held side, that's just going to reinforce that. One end note on that, Lisa, is we have seen NGOs, pretty famous ones, we promised we wouldn't give their names out, but who have for some time now been going into Syria in the north, basically breaking the rules to deliver some aid to the extent they can. And this whole issue of cross-border humanitarian aid in the past 2-3 weeks has really kicked up. I think everybody realizes you just can't go on this way when so many people are suffering.
Well, there looks like there's definitely no alternative. INM Syria says all areas in Syria are either FSA, the Free Syrian Army, or regime-controlled, both of which are armed. Organizations work with the FSA, and of course he's pointing to the bleak situation of how to deliver aid within Syria. Lisa, I know that we had a video comment on this very topic.
We do. It's on the idea of where does this aid really go, who controls it. We spoke with Rami Jara. He's also known as Alexander Page, and he's the co-director of Activist News Association. So he's constantly in and out of Syria, and he's witnessed firsthand the challenges of distributing aid and the role that the rebels play in getting it to those who need it most.
The truth is that you cannot hand out aid across Syria or guarantee that the aid will reach those areas that require it without the help of the FSA or the opposition militants. And these military organizations have that ability, and that means that to some extent a requirement of some agreement has to be reached where there is a civilian body, but the guarantee of getting that aid into those areas would be held by the FSA, and that means that the international community has to recognize that. Otherwise, it's impossible.
Razan, he talks about guarantees. It seems to be a bit of a leap to even use that word in the context of Syria. Is it reasonable to even assume that the FSA can make this happen, given the chance? Razan? I'm not sure Razan can hear us, but Majid, what's your take on that? Can the FSA, if they're involved, get the aid to people who need it, or is that a pretty big leap, kind of going from A to E or F here?
Right. Well, I think the FSA would use that money also for the military equipment that they need. So not all the money will go to the people. But again, I think I'm not sure how the United Nations would be able to deliver that money to the territories which are held by the rebels. And I think again, this is one of the I believe flaws in the international law, which doesn't allow donations to go to the civilian without the permission of the state. So you see here a more state-oriented law than civilian-oriented. Though this is the state, this is the regime which has created this humanitarian crisis.
Well, and speaking of money, one of your areas of expertise is, of course, the geopolitics of the region. And what about this idea of back channels of money from Russia and from Iran, and where this nexus of geopolitics?
Right, right. There've been a lot of focus on donation, but a lot of these monies actually goes on backstage. So, for instance, Russia, in the name of some bilateral economic contracts, they try to help the Syrian regime, and they deliver to them also, besides the money, some arms. And Iran also had increased its ties by $1 billion after the uprising started in Syria. So all those they're coming in the name of just economic bilateral relations, but actually they are more for keeping Assad in power and having the Alawite-based retaining the reign in Syria.
Laura, do you see change occurring at the military level or at the political level?
At the military level. I keep hearing it again and again that those political negotiations, those talks, those figureheads, even people that are respected like Muaz al-Khatib, they just don't have the influence on the ground that they need to change the fight, at least not now, which means that even if we do see a transition, there's no guarantee that the groups that are fighting now are going to stop. It's just that kind of a loose amalgamation of fighting forces right now. And it's interesting, you know, Lisa, I was really reflecting hard before this show on what aid really means in Syria and why people might be fatigued about hearing about Syria. And I think a lot of it is that we hear so many numbers thrown around. We hear so much of the suffering on the scale of 700,000 refugees and at least 60,000 killed. And then out came this article today from AFP, which really, I think, sealed this notion of what happens when so many people are suffering. And it was all about that social fabric of Syria under strain because of what's happening, because of all of this crisis going on. And the UN saying that 74% of refugees are saying that they now beat their children more often situation. So the family breakdown, domestic violence, issues that wouldn't have existed before are now affecting a whole generation of Syrian kids. And for me, that was really the moment that was like, wait, this is how bad it's getting. Syrians love their kids, and if their kids are, I mean, everybody's suffering in so many ways. This is something we need to get a handle on.
Laura, you mentioned earlier that one of the problems that groups on the ground don't have influence. Dealing with the status quo and the groups that do have influence, i.e. the UN, our communities chiming in. Mansour says the UN wasn't established yesterday. They have monitoring and reporting mechanisms ensuring accountability and transparency. And there's also a video comment here left in support. Have a listen.
The UN is not handing cash to the Syrian regime. Yes, there have been questions over the UN's choice of local partners and the relationship of those groups to the government. But the fact is that aid is getting into the country. 48% of the World Food Programme's aid last year went into the rebel-held northern areas of the country, so it is working. The real problem, though, is not this red herring of cash being handed over to the government, which is not happening. It's a lack of money, a lack of freedom of movement around the country, and also the fact that the volunteers' lives are on the line. Questioning the UN's credibility is going to increase those risks.
Laura, your thoughts?
I think the UN's done a great job in the past 2 or 3 weeks showing that it's making efforts to deliver aid to rebel-held areas. We did a Google Hangout with the World Food Programme last week from rebel-held territory. I mean, I think they're doing really the best they can. And the structural issue here isn't that the UN is going to be handing money to the Assad regime or anyone else. That's not what we're saying. It's that the structure of how it traditionally works and why it's taken so long to get more aid to the rebel-held areas, it comes to the way the system is set up. It's not easy to just, without permission, cross over the Turkish border and start handing out aid. It's just under international law, international norms, it's not the done thing. But in this case, it's meant that it's been all the more difficult. It's taken all the longer to get help to that whole broad swath of territory in northern Syria, which also happens to be the area where there is no more government service, no more Assad-provisioned basic welfare. So that's part of why we've seen such a steep drop in the quality of life in those parts of the country.
Razan, in terms of Western media, there's a very black and white view of Bashar al-Assad. But on the ground, are people on the fence between the FSA and Assad?
Okay, people now on the ground, and especially FSA, try to provide the liberated areas and the other areas which are under the regime control with food and with suitable aids. We have our channels, we have our relations with FSA, which can give our process and our aids arrive to the right areas, whatever the people in these areas, their backgrounds, if they are with the regime or with the opposition, we don't care.
All right, Razan, I'm sorry to cut you off. I'm going to have to pause you there. We're going to put a hold on this conversation for just less than a minute. Go to streamed.aljazeera.com. That's where our post show is, and we're going to continue this conversation. Now, tomorrow's program, Human Rights for Asia's LGBT community. We're going to talk to activists from across that region about the challenges that they're facing, so send us your thoughts on that. Welcome to the Stream's online post show. We're continuing our discussion on the Syrian humanitarian crisis and the reported lack of getting aid into the country. Still with us are Majid Rafizadeh, Laura Satrakian, and Razan Shalab Al-Sham. Majid, is there any sort of formula that you see that gets the Assad government and the FSA into some sort of power sharing agreement?
Well, I don't think so for now. I believe that as long as the Assad regime and the Russian government believe, the supporters of Assad believe that the balance of power is in favor of Assad, I don't see why he would change his position and would just share power with the FSA. But I think the other question is, I'm not sure the opposition groups in Syria are willing to go that step. They have already said that the government has lost its legitimacy and credibility, and this is the government which has committed crimes against humanity. So, and more than 60,000 people have been killed. So I'm not sure if really the majority of Syrian people would like to see Assad to keep power and have some sort of like power sharing.
Well, Majid, earlier you were talking about strategic interests and
Right.
people, you know, getting involved in conflicts because of their own strategic interests. On Facebook, Jamil says, this externally guided attempt at regime change callously overrides the interests of a majority of Syrians to wage a geopolitical war of destruction to whose benefit. Well, there's also a video comment here, and I'd like you to have a listen. It's along those same lines.
When it comes to humanitarian aid, Turkey has managed to win hearts and minds of Syrians. Pretty good refugee camps, easy working permits, free of charge healthcare, or even university education. And I strongly believe that Turkey is one of the very few state actors, maybe the only actor, that Syrians are happy for what it has done. And certainly there will be future implications for this for both countries in the post-Assad period.
So we've mentioned Iran, we've mentioned the Gulf and Russia. What's Turkey's role in all this?
Well, Turkey has been, I think Turkey started with diplomatic initiatives and negotiating with the Assad regime first, but then they changed their position and asked Assad to step aside. But again, Turkey has its own geostrategic interests in the region. And unfortunately, when we look at the Syrian case, we see that human rights comes down in the rank of priorities. But first it comes geopolitics, geostrategic, socio-economic interests, and then human rights. So this human rights and the life of the Syrian people is the last thing that really the countries in the region or on the international arena cares about. But again, I think Turkey has had a very difficult situation also because of the flow of the refugees inside the area. Because refugee is not just a humanitarian issue, it's also a security issue.
Right. Razan, Laura, I'm sorry. Laura, I want to ask you a bit of a crystal ball question. A lot of talk about outside countries better arming the FSA. So if that's done and the playing field is leveled so they can be at the negotiating table with Assad, that's option one. Option two is they actually topple the regime while better armed. What happens then? Let's assume that we arm the rebels and they topple Assad.
I don't think we've heard any positive scenario around that sort of an outcome. I mean, there was a really interesting article over the past few days in the New York Times, Roger Cohen's op-ed about why we should intervene, hinting at Senator John McCain's suggestion that we should at the very least be using U.S. firepower to shoot down the Assad missiles that are currently bombarding the north. Okay, so let's say you do that and you take out the air, that's probably the most reasonable thing, you take out the air power of the Assad regime so that there is a more level playing field. But what happens from there? There's no unified command. Everybody's waiting to see who among those rebel groups really carries the day. Is it going to be Jabhat al-Nusra and the more extreme viewed, some say al-Qaeda linked, the U.S. government certainly sees it as terrorist groups taking the fore here because they've been the tip of the spear and they've been so successful in battle? Do they end up taking a larger share of voice in the future Syria? Or are the more moderate groups really going to step up fast enough to make those gains? I think all of the progress that the rebels have made in battle made everybody kind of nervous. Okay, wait, who are these guys now? We don't really know. And what happens the day after? Nobody really has the answer. And is the legitimacy of the likes of Al-Khatib and the National Coalition, is it going to stick? Are they going to be able to come in and really impose any kind of law and order when so much is now in the hands of practically warlords and profiteers? It's really hard.
I hate to say this because this has been such a fascinating discussion, but we are out of time. So my sincere thanks to Laura Satrakian, Majid Rafizadeh, and Razan Shalab al-Sham. But before we part, we do have 1 minute or so left for Malika to tell us about a couple of the other leads that we're following.
Korean pop star Psy, whose YouTube video has the most hits in history, is used to getting attention. But this time, it's because his followers don't want him to perform. Malaysia's ruling party has invited the man behind the mega hit Gangnam Style to perform at a Chinese New Year's celebration. But Psy's Malaysian Facebook followers aren't happy. They've bombarded his page asking him not to become a political pawn for a government they don't support. In both Korean and English, Jackie Yaw said, "If you come to Malaysia, you will become the political tool and your performance will be politicized by Barisan Nasional. It is a political party which is seriously corrupted and always abuses the power to persecute Malaysians." Well, Sure Yi writes, "We love you, we share your songs, we learn your dancing style, but we don't want you to be a tool of our politicians in Malaysia. This is a serious matter, please reconsider." Our next lead comes as New Zealanders prepare to ring in a national holiday and others prepare to protest it. Waitangi Day commemorates a treaty signing that made New Zealand part of the British Empire and granted indigenous Maori land and political rights. Maori activists often demonstrate on the day, saying policies of the government violate aspects of the treaty. Ahead of the commemoration, Twitter user Coley shared this bingo card to highlight what she calls racist speech in the coverage of the Waitangi Day tensions, like colonization improves quality of life. She's also sharing offending articles and politician statements, hoping to help followers mark their cards. Want to comment on those stories? Tweet us with the hashtag AJStream. Lisa?
All right, on Wednesday, Human Rights for Asia's LGBT community. We talked to activists from across the region about the challenges faced by sexual and gender minority groups. Send us your thoughts and your questions on that, and until then, we'll see you online.